Well, Kishore Mahbubani, thank you for coming to Toronto to
My
be
pleasure.
part of this debate. It's a real honor to have you here. Let's jump right in and get your thoughts as to why, at this particular moment, tensions between China and the United States have reached this almost frenetic level over trade. What's going on? What's driving this seeming tempest in a teapot?
Well, it's one of those events that could have been completely predicted in advance. It was inevitable. It was going to happen at some point in time because throughout history, the geopolitics of the time is driven by the relationship between the world's number one power, which today is the United States, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China. And it's always at the point when the world's number one emerging power is about to become bigger than the world's number one power that tensions escalate. So it was going to happen at some point or another. And you can never tell exactly how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, which is why I'm actually writing a book on US-China relations this year. But what triggered it this year was, on the one hand, it was Donald Trump, who's got rather strange views on trade. He would not pass an Economics 101 exam on trade, and yet, despite the fact that his views on trade are so wonky, everybody supports him. Mm-hmm. It's the only one issue in America where Donald Trump gets broad bipartisan support, which is the stand he's taking against China on trade. And clearly the Chinese have made some strategic mistakes in the way that they've handled the United States, handled American businessmen. And so to some extent they're paying a price for this too. But at the end of the day, the real issue is not trade. The real issue is something deeper. Mm-hmm. So even if the trade issue is solved today, tomorrow, or wherever, the dispute between US and China will escalate in the coming decades.
We're going to talk about the liberal international order tonight, which is a somewhat loaded phrase, especially because of the word liberal that's stuck in there. How do you interpret the liberal international order? What are its liberal characteristics?
Well, I have two advantages in terms of understanding the liberal international order. The first, I serve as Singapore's ambassador to the UN for over 10 years. So I have a first-hand experience of how the heart of the liberal international order works, which is the United Nations. But the more important advantage is that I was born into an illiberal international order. Because in 1948, when I was born in Singapore, Singapore's a British colony, and I wasn't even born a citizen, I was born a British subject, or more probably a British object in 1948. So the contrast between what preceded 1945, where you had, in a sense, a few dominant states, the colonial states, running most of the world, making decisions for most of the world in a completely arbitrary fashion with no rules whatsoever. Which is why 1945, especially the UN Charter, marks a watershed moment in world history, because suddenly it's decided that from now on people can determine their own futures. So it delegitimized colonialism, it delegitimized foreign intervention and created the notion of sovereignty. And I think that's one pillar of what the liberal international order is. You decide your own future. And the second pillar of the liberal international order is what I call the rules. And progressively, through the UN, through multilateral institutions, we have progressively accumulated lots of rules on what countries can do and cannot do. And the surprising thing about our world is that most of the time, most countries obey these rules. And that's why, for example, if you look back before 1945, wars between states were very common, At an instant, countries would go to war. But progressively, interstate wars have become a sunset industry, And the chances of a human being dying in interstate war today is the lowest it's ever been. Now, these are the two big advances that have been made by the liberal international order. They've allowed the people to determine their own futures, and they've created a set of rules that all countries follow, and therefore it's a liberal order.
Now, I thought you quite provocatively in an essay for Harper's Magazine rightly flagged the fact that when it comes to understanding the impacts of economic leadership, the two different models, China versus the United States, that interestingly, China might have a pretty good story to tell in terms of their record of economic accomplishment versus a picture in the United States of stagnant wages, stagnant incomes, growing economic inequality. Do you see part of this debate going on right now as a debate between two different economic orders? Or is there a consensus as to what the global economic order should be?
I think there's nothing wrong with the American economic system. But something has gone fundamentally wrong in the American political system, because the political system acted as a kind of adjudicator, and to ensure that as economic growth happened, that you would distribute the fruits of the economic growth more or less equitably. But for reasons that we still don't understand fully, then one of the most shocking things about the United States is that it's the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50%, let me repeat that, 50%, the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 50-year period. So something has gone wrong in the balance of the society and how you allocate the fruits of economic growth. And you know, in one other shocking statistic, which I have in my book, Has the West Lost It?, is that two-thirds of American families, households, don't have $500 in emergency cash. So that something has gone wrong. It's not the economic system. The economy is growing. But how you distribute the fruits, how you distribute the results. And this is where fundamental issues of taxation come in. And I'm writing in my new book, one of the points I'm going to make about the US-China conflict is that what's happened is that the major American political institutions have in a sense been seized or taken over by big money. And big money influences the decisions of the major political institutions. So the capacity of government to act as an impartial referee and umpire to redistribute the fruits of economic growth has gone. And as a result of which, vast numbers of Americans are now suffering. And that also explains the anger which led to the election of Donald Trump.
Stepping back and thinking about some of the arguments that your opponents will put forward tonight, one of them obviously will be that China has given up on economic liberalization, that it is fundamentally an authoritarian regime that is a threat to democracy and to a capital L liberal vision of the liberal international order. Do you feel that's a fair criticism of what's happened in China and the American response?
Well, I would say one has to make a fundamental distinction between the liberal international order and the liberal domestic order. And China clearly does not belong to the category of liberal domestic order. But there's no fundamental contradiction within a country which is non-democratic, like China, behaving according to the rules of the liberal international order. A lot of confusion is created fundamentally by the word liberal. And as you know, I mean, I know many of the scholars myself, you know, in this field. And, you know, just to quote two of them, I'm going to mention this tonight. The leading realist thinker in America is John Mearsheimer. I just said, John, can I quote you as saying that America is a bigger threat to the liberal international order than China? He said, Kishore, go ahead. So I have his permission. And then look at the recent statement that John Eikenberry has made. Eikenberry is probably the leading writer on the liberal international order issues. And he said, I never thought I would see the day when the liberal international order will be killed not by murder, but by suicide. So it is the proponents of the liberal international order of the United States, which are the primary killers of the liberal international order, because the United States is walking away from the constraining rules that exist, that have been developed in the liberal international order. So the paradox we have in the world today is that China is not a democracy, America is a democracy, but it's a democracy that is a bigger threat to the liberal international order than a non-democracy.
Just to push that line of questioning a little bit further, though, I mean, it is interesting at the extent to which, at least in the Western media, we are fed a steady diet of China's authoritarian sins of omission and commission, whether it's the internment of large numbers of their Uyghur population, whether it's the seeming adoption of a mass system of state surveillance. Yeah. Are we interpreting the world through the kind of thought categories of the past? Have we gone back to a kind of Cold War mythology, or maybe even a pre-Cold War mythology, maybe a World War II mythology, that this is somehow not just a struggle about trade, it's a struggle for democracy against an evil, as some people would characterize it, authoritarian regime?
Well, you know, the strange thing about the Western media and thinkers becoming progressively more and more negative about China's track record in the past few decades is that if you ask the Chinese people from their point of view, since Chinese history began, which have been the best 30 years China has ever had in the last 3,000 years, and the best 30 years that Chinese people have had has been the past 30 years, because you've seen this dramatic removal of poverty, 800 million people rescued from absolute poverty. And when I first went to China in 1980, people in China couldn't choose where to live, where to work, what to wear, where to study, and certainly no Chinese could travel overseas. Mm-hmm. That was 30 years ago. Actually now closer to 40. Now, you go to China, people can choose where to live, where to work, what to wear, where to study. And amazingly enough, for a communist gulag state, like the Soviet Union used to be, which they allowed zero tourists. Mm-hmm. Each year from China, 134 million Chinese leave China freely and travel overseas.
And guess what? They come back.
And amazingly, 134 million Chinese who could choose to stay overseas return to China freely. Now, if you believe that voting with your feet is a very powerful voting mechanism, that's a very powerful voting mechanism. And the number will go up to 200 million very soon. Mm-hmm. People who say, hey, I love this country. It's been good for me. And why is that so? And so I think the fundamental problem in Western perceptions of China is that Western minds have become trapped in a time bubble, an artificial time bubble of 200 years of Western domination of world history, which is coming to an end, and therefore are unable to enter into other thought bubbles which exist in a very different, with a very different worldview. And from the Chinese point of view, one clear lesson of 2,200 years of continuous Chinese history is that when the center is weak, the people suffer. When the center is strong, people benefit. Mm-hmm. So when you have strong leaders in China like Xi Jinping, he's popular. People like him. Their life is better. Mm-hmm. So how is it that a country like United States of America, which has a population of 300 million plus, 1/4 China's population, and with a political history that is only 1/10, I think, roughly, right? The Republic is less than 250 years old. This new nouveau riche just arrived on the political scene. He's saying, I know better for you, China.
Yes.
And even though you had 2,000 years of history, you don't know what's good for you.
Right.
And I think at some point in time, if you're a Chinese leader, you have to understand and live within your own political culture. And there are tremendous constraints about running China, because each day that China stays together, each day, 1.4 billion people working together, is a miracle. It's incredibly hard work. It requires a kind of governance which is not, by the way, completely top-down. It requires an understanding of what the people can accept, will not accept, and so on and so forth. Because if 1.4 billion people decide to rise up, no government can stop them. Yeah. And so there is a Chinese political dynamic that is operating. And those of us who live outside should not presume that we know better than the Chinese what is good for them.
Final question, because you come from Singapore, you represented Singapore as a diplomat, you lived there. This debate is originating out of Canada. What should smaller countries like Canada and Singapore do to, let's hope, thrive, but maybe let's say simply survive the clash of these two big global powers? Where is our, if any, advantage in this scenario? Or frankly, is this going to be just an exceedingly difficult period geopolitically for middle powers like Canada and Singapore?
Well, I think the first thing we should remember is the wisdom contained in an old Sri Lankan proverb which says, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. When elephants make love, the grass also suffers. So whether or not they fight or they make love, we're going to get into trouble.
Right.
So it's important for us, number one, to figure out what kind of environment is the best constraining environment for these great powers. And fortunately for us, this is where the liberal international order is so important. The United Nations has created all kinds of rules which in a sense act like constraining nets on these superpowers. So one thing that Canada and Singapore should do together, and a common interest we have, is to strengthen the United Nations as much as possible. And I remember when I was ambassador to the UN and trying to strengthen UN rules and treaties and so on and so forth, I found that Canada was one of the strongest partners that we could work with, because Canada also deeply believed in multilateralism. Although you went through a phase where, to my surprise, you actually walked away from it, and I was very puzzled. This doesn't serve Canada's national interests. But I'm glad you're coming back to the position that you used to hold. So I think the one thing we need to do is to realize that the post-1945 rules-based liberal international order is a huge gift as well as an asset for small and medium-sized states, and we should work together to strengthen it as much as possible, knowing full well that the big powers in their own way will try to reduce it, and especially, unfortunately, the United States. And in fact, the conclusion of my book, Has the West Lost It?, is that the best way for the United States to constrain a future China is to use UN rules, because that's what, at the end of the day, will be a more effective net than anything else.